welcome to our event this afternoon. My name is Lanice Williams, and I serve as the chair for the Women in Global Health DC chapter. Thank you for joining us for this virtual event on Putting Women and Girls First, Assessing the National Strategy on Gender Equity and Equality. We are pleased to partner with the Women in Global Health USA chapters in Georgia, Seattle, and the Midwest. And our chapters are part of the ever-growing 40 Women in Global Health chapters in 36 countries. The organization Women in Global Health was established in 2015 as a movement to elevate the leadership of women in global health institutions and expand gender equity in the delivery of healthcare around the world. WGH engaged stakeholders from other global health organizations, governments, civil society, foundations, academia, professional associations, and the private sector. WGH has more than 50,000 supporters across 90 countries. As you know, in October of 2021, the Biden-Harris administration released its first ever national gender strategy to advance the full participation of all people, including women and girls, in the United States and around the world. This groundbreaking strategy, developed by the White House Gender Policy Council, will serve as a roadmap for our government-wide efforts to advance gender equity and equality, and will guide the administration's domestic and foreign policy agenda. Today, we'll be in conversation with key US government and global health foreign policy leaders that will provide us an overview of the new gender strategy, explore how the administration plans to implement the strategy and measure success, speak a little bit briefly about their role on the interagency coordination group, and learn how the community can support efforts to roll out this strategy. Now I'm pleased to introduce Haley Pritchett, advisory panel member with the Women in Global Health Seattle chapter.
Thank you, Lanice. Hi, all. As Lanice mentioned, I'm Haley Pritchett. I'm an advisory panel member for Women in Global Health Seattle. And it is an absolute privilege to be able to extend a welcome to our panelists and to all of you joining us today. From the perspective of women in global health, women play a vital role in the advancement of global health, and yet men remain the majority holders of leadership positions. Globally, women make up 75% of healthcare workforce, yet occupy less than 25% of the most influential leadership positions. In the US, according to a 2019 Census Bureau report, women make up more than 85% of healthcare workers. The Catalyst report, also from 2019, indicated that only 19% of hospitals in the US are led by women. In the healthcare industry, only 13% of CEOs are women, and fewer than 33% of senior leadership roles are held by women. The contribution of women to health systems is monumental, and yet we know that much of their work, especially that considered to be caregiving roles, is either underpaid or unpaid, leaving women with few opportunities for advancement or to care for their own health. Now, as of October, in the US, we have the Biden-Harris administration's national gender strategy, which was fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic exacerbated the economic and caregiving crises that many women and girls, especially those with intersectional identities, have and continue to struggle with. This strategy takes an intersectional look at 10 interconnected priorities: economic security, gender-based violence, health, education, justice and immigration, human rights and equality under the law, security and humanitarian relief, climate change, science and technology, and democracy, participation, and leadership, which I will leave to our panelists to delve a little bit further into. Now, you might have noticed that I've said intersectional a couple of times. For most of us on this call, this is not a new term. However, its use in a US governmental strategy is so critical, because as most of us know, without this lens, these strategies will continue to remain inequitable. This approach considers the barriers and challenges faced by those who experience intersecting and compounding forms of discrimination and bias related to gender, race, and other factors, including sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, disability, age, and socioeconomic status. And intersectionality ties into just about every element of this strategy, from the impact of gender violence and the intentional inclusion of the murdered and missing Indigenous women, to the maternal mortality crisis that we know disproportionately impacts Black and Indigenous women, and to climate change, which the UN Women's 66th Commission on the Status of Women, which is ending this week, chose as its theme this year. It's with this intersectional lens that we can lead this work forward. As a global and public health professional, as a mother to young children, and an intersectional feminist, I am excited to learn more about these strategies from our expert panelists and to learn more about what we can do together to build momentum, to enable our environments and lead sustainable change. I'd like to take one quick second to loop back to the exponential growth the WHO and the movement has had in the past 7 years that Lenice referenced, and what that means. Right now, the United States is the only country that has multiple WGH chapters, which to me speaks to just how needed this work is, both globally and locally, and that we are now gaining momentum to tackle this work. And it makes being able to collaborate and build relationships across the multiple chapters for this event so crucial. And on that note, I'm going to hand things back to Lenice to introduce our amazing speakers.
Thank you so much, Haley. Now I'd like to introduce our phenomenal and amazing speakers for this afternoon. First, we have Verena Winder, who is the Senior Advisor on the Office of Global Women's Issues at the U.S. State Department. In this role, Verena leads policy development, interagency coordination, and strategic operations. And prior to her appointment, she worked at the UN Foundation as the Senior Manager for Global Partnerships and Strategic Engagement on the Family Planning 2020. Next, we have Dr. Stephanie Saki, who is the Senior Advisor on Human Rights and Gender Equality at the Office on Global Affairs in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Prior to her appointment to this role, she served as the Director of the Populations Council Girls Innovation Research and Learning Center, where she provided guidance to governments, international organizations, and philanthropies on investing resources to expand opportunities for women and girls globally. And lastly, we have Jamilia Biggio, Senior Coordinator for the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Hub in the Office of the Administrator at USAID. Prior to joining USAID, Ms. Biggio served as the Senior Fellow on Women in Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she researched, lectured, and published widely on the relationship between gender equality, national security, and global prosperity. Verena, Stephanie, and Jamilia, thank you for being with us this evening. And I would like to ask you first, starting with Verena, if you can just give us an overview of the strategy and the work that your agency is doing, particularly on the strategy rollout and implementation.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Lenice, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Haley, for those opening remarks and the reminder of why we're all here and why we're all doing the work that we're doing. And thank you to the entire nexus of Women in Global Health chapters for your invitation to speak. Today, I'm not currently an active member given my role with the administration, but I was previously a member of the DC chapter. And so just really glad to be among friends, especially at the end of or near the end of what has been kind of a long week, a long month. I think CSW is wrapping tomorrow at some point. So we're limping along here. So thank you. It's nice to be among friends, and it's nice to be kind of outside of the DC, New York bubble. As mentioned, as Lenice mentioned, my name is Verena Winder. I'm the Senior Advisor for the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues. We like to call it SGWE here at the Department of State, or the Department as we like to also shorten it. Our mission is really to lead the State Department's efforts to promote the rights and empowerment of women and girls through everything that we do relating to foreign policy. So that's our diplomacy, both multilateral and bilateral diplomacy, our partnerships, and our programs. So I'll talk, just to answer Lenise's question, I'll talk really briefly to three things today. Normally, I think our colleague at the White House Gender Policy Council would give sort of an overview of what the national gender, the U.S. national strategy on gender equity and equality will be about. I'll try to do that justice first. Second, I'll talk a little bit about what the State Department is doing. And then third, if there's time or if there's interest, talk a little bit about how we're thinking about engaging with civil society as we move in and later into this year. So as both Haley and Lenise mentioned, last October, the Biden-Harris administration released the first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality, which really does everything that Haley just mentioned. It really reaffirms the U.S. commitment to advancing the rights and empowerment of all women and girls and all their diversity as both a strategic and moral imperative. The White House Gender Policy Council, which was established just a little bit over a year ago via executive order on International Women's Day last March 8th, worked across more than 30 government agencies as well as civil society to really establish this comprehensive agenda, which crosses both the foreign policy realm and the domestic policy realm. In terms of civil society engagement, some brief stats that I thought were just really incredible in terms of the level and breadth of engagement, especially led by the Gender Policy Council, but which I know that Stephanie was involved in and Jamila was involved in as well. They convened more than 250 leaders from Congress, from nonprofit communities, community-based organizations, academics, faith-based, health organizations, state, local, tribal, territorial government officials, labor unions, private sector, as well as we were obviously engaged in engagements with foreign governments, especially those governments that already have feminist foreign policies or foreign policies that focus on gender equity and equality, multilateral organizations, and almost 300 young women and or youth leaders. We think that this strategy is really significant for a number of reasons. One, it's the first ever. And it really does reaffirm and bring back sort of this administration focus and leadership on gender equality. Two, it is a whole of government effort. So my office has been around officially since 2009 with an ambassador level position. We do have these pockets of focus on gender equity and equality that have been longstanding. Jamila will talk a little bit about her office as well, or her leadership there. But this is really asking everybody to do this work, that it is a whole of government. And then third, again, sort of related to that, it's both domestic and it's foreign policy. We're recognizing that we can walk and we should walk and chew gum at the same time, that we have things to offer and to learn and to invest in, and we have things that we should be intaking as well. Briefly, for those of you who haven't read the strategy, it's about 50 pages, divided into three sections. One is sort of, the first section is the guiding principles section, sorry. I'm back at the office, can you tell? So guiding principles is section one, and that's really where we get to that focus on intersectionality that Haley mentioned. That's where we get to the focus on whole of government, sort of why we're doing this, the importance of this. Section two is the longest. It goes through, and I won't list them all because Haley did that already, but the 10 interconnected priorities. And I think that what was really so heartening here is that for every single priority, we sort of attack it or tackle it from both a domestic policy framework and also from a foreign policy framework. And so that we're seeing how a Black maternal health crisis might drive other underinvested communities through sort of our foreign policy lens. And then three is an ask for an implementation plan. So we've diagnosed the problem, we've looked at it from all angles. What are we going to do about it? And that's, I think, a good segue to what is very early stage thinking from the State Department as to what are we going to do about it. So Secretary Blinken, the Secretary of State, has made clear to us both privately and publicly what his commitment is around driving forward on gender equity and equality. And my office is the department's lead designee, both to the White House Gender Policy Council, as well as the department lead for all of these issues. And so we'll be leading the agency implementation plan, and that's work that we've just begun to kick off. All of those implementation plans are due in July, late this summer. The good news is that this strategy is already more than words on paper. It's already creating a demand signal. It's already a sort of an encouraging tool that we've been able to use to get toward advancing gender equity and equality. So a good example of that is, some of you will know that the president's budget is coming out, the request is coming out next Monday, but we've already been able to announce and use the strategy sort of really as that umbrella tool to get to a place where we're going to be announcing a historic doubling for foreign assistance programs that would promote gender equality worldwide. So we're going to go from approximately 1.3 to 2.6 billion as a request. And this also includes a very specific request for $200 million for a new gender equity and equality fund that we launched last summer, which will focus on women's economic security in a very holistic way. For the State Department, we see this strategy as sort of being an umbrella to cap off some of the three sort of high-level priorities that we've had for a long time. One, a focus on women's peace and security. Two, a focus on women's economic security. And three, a focus on preventing and addressing and responding to gender-based violence. We, from both the department and my office in SG, we focus on programs. So that's that GIA fund that I just talked about, where we're going to be investing in various places to hopefully drive economic security for women and girls. My office is unique in that we do have a small pot of funding that we have already been implementing, and so we hope to be using lessons learned from there to drive some of those further programs. Then we also, of course, engage in multilateral diplomacy, such as the CSW, bilateral diplomacy, and public diplomacy. Some of you may have tuned in, for example, to our International Women of Courage Award winners, which took place, I think, last week. March is obviously a bit of a blur, but it's a good example of the ways that we try and can use sort of our embassies and consulates around the world to engage with women leaders around the world. Finally, the one thing that I would flag that's unique to our office is we really do focus on personnel and institutionalization. We provide a lot of gender analysis training to technical capacity building to our colleagues here in the building and around the world. And so that's something that we're thinking about and taking really seriously as we think about what's going to be in these action plans. So taking all of that, just to a broad nutshell, what's going to be in the action plan. One, we're thinking about this in terms of what we call deliverables, or big announceable things for the administration. So what are the kinds of big things that we want to think about for the rest of this administration, and what can kind of move the needle moving forward? And then two, what's going to sustain that? That's the question that's really animating a lot of our conversations these days. Like, what are some of the institutional norms and changes that we're going to have to take as the State Department, the trainings, the management reforms, the updates to our foreign affairs manual that can really hold the line even after this administration. So a good example, and I'll just kind of wrap here, is we have been thinking a lot about in our office, and some of you may have tuned into the Democracy Summit, or the Summit for Democracy back in December. Our office hosted or helped to organize the first meeting on technology facilitated gender-based violence. We followed that up during a CSW side event earlier this week, I believe. We are thinking about what this looks like. What is a partnership around technology facilitated gender-based violence? And we are calling for members to join us so that we can sort of strengthen and clarify online harassment and abuse as a form of gender-based violence, develop a base of shared principles, develop best practices, strengthen support, including financial support for those who experience it, and try to hold perpetrators of that abuse to account. We are actively recruiting additional member countries to join this partnership, and so hopefully you'll continue to see this partnership grow from here. But if that's the deliverable, if that's the sort of program and the thematic focus, what we're trying to do to take a step further is, okay, so we can make this announcement, what will make it real? So for us, we're thinking about what are the trainings that human rights officers around the world will need to take in order to recognize and to understand gender-based violence. How do we kind of grow our own tech facility and tech knowledge? Can we report on technology facilitated gender-based violence, for example, via our human rights reports? And if we can, what does that look like? So I'll kind of wrap there and just say that we are continued and we are committed to a consultative process with civil society. We have a number of other strategies that are under development and that we're thinking through, including on economic security and on gender-based violence. And so moments like these, and I think actually Stephanie and Jamila and I all did a similar kind of talk recently here in DC too. These are the kinds of engagements and opportunities that provide a lot of fodder for us to go home and or to the back to the office and think through what it is that we should be doing next. So thank you, Lanice, and thank you, Haley, for having us.
Thank you. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to go next.
Sure. Thanks, Verena. Great introduction and overview. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. And thank you, Lanice and Haley, for the invitation and for bringing us here. It's great to just keep an eye on the chat and look at the amazing other people who are joining us. I'm sure you all could give talks about what you're working on that would be similarly or maybe more interesting than what we're sharing now. So hopefully we can turn the tables at some point. So I'm just going to share a quick overview about the office that I work in at the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and some of the priority issues that we're tackling through our gender work globally, some of which are linked with the gender strategy, some of which go build on the gender strategy, and then can definitely go into more detail on each of these later, but I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A and also to hear from Jamila. So I'm in the Office of Global Affairs at HHS, and basically our office is the diplomatic voice of the Ministry of Health for the US government. So our counterparts are ministries of health around the world, and we work closely, largely through CDC, but not exclusively through CDC, on the ground in countries around the world, often in partnership with USAID to advance public health priorities. In this office, and similar to GWE, where Verena sits, we are in the office of the Secretary at HHS. So we have the ear of the Secretary, and we also work closely with colleagues around the US government, including at the Gender Policy Council and in the White House, to advance the administration's priorities. So that's where we sit. I think HHS is in an interesting place as we think about carrying out the gender strategy, because we work both domestically and globally, and much of HHS's work is domestic. So our priorities for the gender strategy and how we approach them will largely reflect domestic work that's ongoing, but there also will be mirrors on the global side in terms of how we're implementing globally. And then in some ways, our global work will probably continue to build on and expand beyond those domestic priorities. So to lay out a few areas that we're thinking of working on right now, and as Verena said, the implementation plan phase is still early, so subject to change. So sexual and reproductive health and rights is a priority area for the administration and for Secretary Becerra. He's been pretty outspoken about this area of work before he joined HHS, before he joined the administration, and as Secretary of Health and Human Services. So I think we see this moment as the first year of the administration. We laid out what the vision is, what the priorities are, and now as we're in the second year of the administration, we're moving toward concrete action, both to expand access to services in a very practical way in the US and support that work through ministries of health around the world, but also to build more sustainable change. And I think part of that is doing the work diplomatically of trying to reframe this conversation and remind ourselves domestically, but also our partners around the world, that SRH is really a health equity issue. So this is part of healthcare. This is part of broader access to services for all populations. And when we separate out SRH issues, what we're really doing is saying that some groups of people can't have access to care, which is not consistent with the commitments that we've made to the Sustainable Development Goals and otherwise. So I think reframing that conversation is a really important piece of our work right now. So I definitely can say more about that, but another priority area with regard to gender is around climate and health. So we participated in COP26 and committed to the WHO climate and health strategy. and that required domestic commitments on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the health system. So we are doing that through the federal health system, through HHS domestically, as well as building more resilient health systems in the US. So you might be aware and not surprised perhaps that the US health system contributes about a third of the greenhouse gas emissions globally from health systems. So this commitment to reducing emissions domestically is hugely important in terms of the effects of those emissions on health around the world, but it's also important in terms of the leadership that we're showing globally. However, there is also, and this is very much a topic of discussion at CSW this week and last week, which, as someone noted, is looking at these connections. There historically has not been a strong focus on gender at the COPs. And so we're thinking about how we can do a better job of uplifting these connections between climate, health, and gender, looking forward to COP27, but most immediately as we speak in the negotiations for CSW. So another topic of work, which is sort of unavoidable in this moment, is around global health security. Obviously, COVID-19 and other global health security challenges have really dominated a lot of the time and energy, both domestically and globally for HHS over the first year of the administration. And that's certainly a challenge in terms of the distraction from other public health priorities. But it also is an opportunity because a lot of those global health systems are sort of being restructured right now, again, as we speak. And we're part of those conversations. So making sure that we're including equity as part of it, but gender equity in particular is essential. And so part of what we're doing is trying to broaden the conversation beyond the essential point around equity and access to vaccines, which certainly is core, but not the only area where equity comes up in global health security. So what else does it mean to have an equitable pandemic preparedness approach and response? And in particular, what are the gendered implications throughout planning and execution? And then the final area to just mention, which really I could start with because it's really the organizing area of a lot of what we do, is strengthening health systems. So, again, there's been such a focus on responding to COVID and global health security in this moment, but we know and we've been reminded that all of that depends so much on how strong our health systems are to begin with, and in particular, the availability and training and diversity and safety and protection of health workers. So that is a core priority across HHS domestically and globally, and we're working closely with the White House on a few forthcoming initiatives, including Build Back Better World, which we call B3W, which was launched at the G7 meeting last year and continues to be rolled out by the White House, has a pillar of focus on health and health security and a strong emphasis within that pillar on investing in health workers, because we know that health workers are essential to well-functioning health systems, and well-functioning health systems are essential to global health security and other public health goals. So I will pause there, and again, happy to talk about any of those issues in more detail, and I think turn it over to Jamila next.
Great, thanks so much. Such a pleasure to be with you all, and such a pleasure to join Verena and Stephanie in this conversation. So just building on what they've said, so as you know, my role is to serve as USAID's Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. We shifted this position back up into the Office of the Administrator so that I can, from that perch, help drive out and work with the incredible gender architecture we have across the agency. We have the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Hub in our Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation. We have gender advisors in all of our bureaus and missions helping to take this work forward. We have a Women, Peace, and Security team in our Center for Conflict Prevention. We have gender teams in our Food Security Bureau, in our Global Health Bureau, truly across the agency. So we've got an incredible staffing structure, training structure in fulfillment as well, kind of with the legal requirements we have in place, requiring us to do gender analyses to inform all of our programs and policies. So we've got this incredible structure in place. We then had Administrator Power come in and lay out on top of that a vision for global development that elevates attention to gender and inclusive development. And that underscores that USAID has long understood that gender equality and women's empowerment are fundamental to achieving sustainable development outcomes, unlocking human potential on a transformational scale. And we are now looking at what are the opportunities for us to bring that work to the next level? How can we deliver on that vision more? As part of that, the administrator in November committed that USAID would double our gender work. And we're thrilled to see the White House, the president, pick that up and help us fulfill that ambition with the president's budget request, including $2.6 billion for foreign assistance programs that promote gender equity and equality worldwide. As Verena noted, more than double the amount that had been requested in the previous year. So at USAID, we're really looking forward to working with the State Department to take that budget forward and to identify what the opportunities are for us to truly invest in both standalone programming for gender equality and women's empowerment and integrating attention to gender equality and women's empowerment across more of our programs, across our sectors, to really recognize that by unlocking the full potential of half the population, we will advance our goals in any given program and initiative. The administrator in her vision for global development also committed that the agency would undertake reforms to make our aid more accessible, to be able to work with a broader coalition of partners, to make our aid more equitable, to ensure that we are more focused on the voices and needs of the most marginalized and underserved, and to make our aid more responsive to what our partners in the countries where we work are asking of us. And as part of that, we've made a commitment to localization. So the administrator committed that within 4 years, a quarter of our work, 25% of our funding would be through local partners. And I share all of that because that is a backdrop for the work that we are doing to take forward the national strategy on gender equity and equality. Because as we do take that work forward, we are focused on what are groundbreaking steps that we can take across USAID's investments that will truly help move the needle forward. And that's where we're looking at how we draw on the resources that have been requested in the budget, how we draw on the Gender Equity and Equality Action Fund that Verena mentioned, that's focused on women's economic security, how we take all of this forward to truly advance our vision of unlocking the full potential of half the population. And here are some of the areas that we are thinking about or are looking at opportunities to expand our reach to help millions more primary and secondary school age girls get the education they need to pursue their dreams. We are looking at how we can help countries around the world build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the priorities in that space is looking at the economic effects of the pandemic, how it how women were disproportionately pushed out of the workforce. So ensuring we help them return, that they have access to the care economy and care infrastructure that they need to return. And as part of this, thinking about how countries and economies are transitioning in a just way to green economies. We are thinking about women's and girls' civic and political leadership to help build a pipeline of civic-minded and politically interested women and girls while helping them exercise their rights and achieve greater representation and address the enabling environment that makes it harder for women to participate, including issues like violence against women in politics, technology-facilitated gender-based violence, among those issues. We have a vision of making more progress in creating a world free of gender-based violence. And this includes attention to the full spectrum of gender-based violence, and thinking too about the work that's critical around gender norms to build healthy partnerships with men and boys and engage them in promoting equal partnerships and promoting opportunities for the full participation of women and girls in society. We are also investing in quality healthcare. So as we talk about that area today, some of the areas we're thinking about is how we can look at access to quality healthcare for young people of all gender identities, including around sexual and reproductive health and rights. We are also thinking about the climate crisis. We are pleased that we'll be issuing USAID's climate strategy soon, and there you will see a commitment to equity within our approach that includes commitments around advancing women's and girls' leadership and participation, and increasing their access to green jobs and climate finance. Also looking at the intersection of gender-based violence and climate. One of the things the administrator has said on this topic is that climate change is sexist, but our response shouldn't be. And this is something that USAID is truly committed to taking forward. And finally, recognizing USAID is the largest humanitarian donor, we are looking across the humanitarian space to identify opportunities where we can promote women's leadership, prioritize gender-based violence prevention and response, and shift more funding, influence, and decision-making power to girls and women within humanitarian response systems. So these are just a few of the areas that we are thinking about. As we think about the economic space and work and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, I would also highlight the commitments that we have around advancing gender equity in the healthcare workforce, recognizing helping support their leadership and advancement in the field. So these, again, are just a few of the areas that we are focused on. We are continuing our work across the agency to also look at how we can continue to strengthen how we integrate attention to gender equality across all of our programs, making sure our staff have the support and the tools they need to do this work. So it's an ambitious agenda, and really kind of taking forward the vision of the national strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamelia, Stephanie, and Verena. You guys really gave us a really in-depth overview of what each of your agency is doing as it relates to the strategy, but overall your commitment to achieving gender equity and equality. I would say, just thinking about this strategy, we know it's not saying anything new. It's basically codifying a lot of things that many gender champions and foreign policy advocates have been speaking about as it relates to achieving gender equity and equality, not only in the US, but globally. Can you highlight where you see some of the most significant and timely opportunities in this strategy, particularly in the work that you might be doing through your agencies? Verena, I don't know if you want to start first.
Sure. Yes. I'm happy to start. And I think that the interesting thing is that you'll get a little bit of a different perspective, I think, from each of the agencies, which I think highlights how much work and how much scope there is to take on. And I think that a lot of times in government, that is the real challenge, right? Is saying that one thing is a priority, because in reality, a lot of things are priorities. But I'll just hone in on your use of the word timely, because I think that really does speak to a lot of the work and the ways in which government works. So the horrible and the truthful answer is that there are lots and lots and lots of challenges that we're facing right now, and we have to be acting in a timely way to address all of them. So Stephanie talked a little bit about the climate crisis. That's a real crisis, and that's a real gender crisis. That's a real crisis for everybody. And so we need to be, we're focusing on that. And I think that the gender strategy provides a real linkage and a real tool in a way that we haven't really seen before, to think about gender in climate. And CSW, I think, is bringing this up. And so everything that we're doing with COP, everything that we are doing post Glasgow, everything that we're doing through the CSW as we prepare for the next COP, all of those things are timely, they're important, they're priorities. There is an economic crisis, there's a health crisis, and there's a violence crisis, all linked to COVID-19. And so that is both an enormous challenge, and also hopefully if we play our cards right, and if we actually invest, and if we do the things that we say that we're going to do, that could be an opportunity. And so one of the things, for example, Jamila mentioned the economic impact of COVID and women being forced, not choosing, but being forced to leave the workforce, is how do we invest in a care infrastructure? I think we've all heard the White House talk a lot about what they hope to achieve domestically, but we're also thinking about what could we invest in globally to address this in a, again, timely way. Same thing when it comes to violence, for example. We know that violence has been an uptick all around the world. And so as we are looking to, the State Department is together with USAID drafting an updated version of the strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. We know that any strategy that we'll put out has to take into account the fact that we're seeing uptakes in child marriage or child early forced marriage. We're seeing uptakes in technology facilitated gender-based violence, that we're seeing that the climate crisis will have a real impact in gender-based violence. So we're trying to onboard all of those things into how we think about that and how we draft that, and ultimately how we draft it will inform how we invest. And then I think in terms of other opportunities, I'll just bang the drum on institutionalization one more time. There are sort of the policy, and there are the moments, for example, Afghanistan, for example, Ukraine, for example, Burma, Ethiopia, a lot of countries around the world where we are really focused on a specific crisis. But what we also need to be able to do at the State Department is build a muscle so that when what happens in Afghanistan happens, we know that women and girls will bear the brunt, that we know that they will bear the load in these different humanitarian crises. And so that's also what we're trying to do, is make sure that everybody in the department, not just GWE, not just the various gender advisors, but everybody in the department feels some sense of ownership over this agenda. And that's really what I hope the lasting legacy of the strategy will be. And I think that is kind of, if we can get that right, then that timely word becomes just consistency.
Thank you so much, Verena. Stephanie?
Yeah, I'll just add to that and say, I think coming from the perspective of HHS, so the gender strategy is this incredible vision that weaves together the interconnected challenges and opportunities on gender across these 10 areas. I think in a lot of ways unprecedented and responds to the moment. And also we know that within each of these areas, so within health, for example, we can't in a gender strategy go into detail on every way that gender and health are connected, right? So I think it opens the door to deepening those connections between health and climate, and health and GBV, and health and economic empowerment, and all these different areas. In terms of timeliness, I think from the perspective of HHS within the US, we are facing the possibility of a Supreme Court decision this spring or early summer that overturns Roe v. Wade. And Secretary Becerra has been pretty clear that we should be thinking and working within HHS to figure out what we can do to make sure that services are available within the law and what's possible to address that situation, including the expectation that there'll be an increase in unsafe abortions, increase in maternal mortality and morbidity, potentially, particularly among women who have limited access to care. So I think it's very timely in the sense that the gender strategy really addresses that challenge on the domestic side. And I think at HHS, where we're working both domestically and globally, we have to think about and anticipate the diplomatic implications and maybe programmatic implications of a huge shift in domestic policy in the US in terms of leadership globally. So those domestic and global connections and the gender strategy, I think, are hugely important as well.
Thank you, Stephanie and Jamelia.
Yeah, I would just add, agree with what my colleagues have shared, and would just add that I think it is critical to use the moments where there are attention to help drive integration. So as we as a global community are focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, within that work, focusing on the issues that relate to gender equality and women's empowerment, from gender equity in the healthcare workforce to the GBV pandemic, to why were women disproportionately pushed out of the labor force and what investments we need to do to help bring them back, to girls' education. What are the systemic barriers that are making it harder to bring adolescent girls back to school? These are all systemic issues that we can use this moment to help shine. This moment has shown a spotlight on them, and we can use it to help drive more resources and attention and commitment to helping make progress in addressing and resolving these longstanding systemic barriers. That's on the pandemic. On climate, the same. As we continue to try to build momentum for climate solutions, it is critical that we are making sure that half the population can fully contribute and help us make that progress. We know we won't be as effective in adaptation, in resilience, in building green economies if we don't engage half the population in that. And that means new ways of lifting up women and girl leaders, of protecting them from violence when they do take those leadership roles, of promoting their economic opportunities. So again, that is kind of seizing the moment of the attention to the crises in front of us to help make progress on these longstanding barriers and discrimination that have held women and girls back for too long.
Thank you so much for that. I know each of you just really talked about some of like the various integration approaches, from gender and health, gender and climate change, gender and GBV, and also talking a little bit about the challenges, and also taking a very much so intersectional approach, which Hallie highlighted earlier. And I would say, when looking at the strategy, what really stands out is its intersectional approach to really addressing many of the inequalities, the biases, systemic racism, and the various systemic barriers that women and girls face globally, not only in healthcare, but in other sectors, from education. Can you talk to me a little bit about how your agency is working to address some of these unique vulnerabilities that women and girls are facing, not only in the US, but globally? And maybe we'll start with you, Jamelia.
Yeah, so as we look at the unique vulnerabilities of women and girls, this is something that we have, as I said, a legal requirement to conduct gender analyses as part of our programs to inform our activities and our programs and our policies. And those gender analyses take two fronts, both to look at what risks do we see for women and girls and men and boys around gender norms, et cetera, with the programming in the sector that the program is working in, and what opportunities do we see? So looking at both of those fronts, what opportunities we see of how women and girls can contribute to the efforts underway. So that is a piece that helps us look across all of our programs to think about these issues. We also have standalone programming and commitments to gender-based violence and integrating attention to gender-based violence in other sectors, and of really growing our community of practice to really think about and understand how can we tap all of the ways in which USAID works around the world to help build societies free from violence, and to recognize that we're not going to achieve our global development goals if we don't do so, that it is that gender-based violence, addressing gender-based violence, is a precondition for women and girls to be able to fully participate in society. So it builds on that recognition, using our tools of gender analysis, using the trainings that we have for staff to help mobilize our agency to address these vulnerabilities.
Thank you, Stephanie, and then Verena after Stephanie.
Sure, yeah. So just to give an example, and again, these domestic global connections. So I think the the ways that health risks and health emergencies play out differently for different individuals and different groups based on identities and often intersecting identities has played out in a way that is very clear. You know, living in the US over the last couple of years and watching what's happened with COVID-19, we know that especially for racial minorities, for Black women in particular, exposure to COVID-19 has been higher, and also the risk of negative outcomes after exposure, after testing positive, has been higher. So in response to some of those trends, the president created a domestic health equity task force on COVID-19 to look at what was happening and come up with recommendations. And so we've tried to apply some of those lessons, and I think we've seen similar patterns around the world for groups that are historically marginalized and excluded from services, have had higher exposure and more negative outcomes from COVID-19. So we tried to apply some of those lessons abroad, and I think that's where we're making this connection to integrating gender equity and equality into pandemic preparedness and response plans. So even though the discussion around equity has been very focused on vaccine equity, which again is a hugely important part, we know that equity in pandemic preparedness and response is much more complicated than that. So thinking about things like the care economy, access to care, paid leave, access to safe housing, access to quality healthcare, all of these issues are hugely important in making sure that we're prepared for the next public health crisis. And we're trying to build those into systems in a way that forces those systems both in the US and around the world, and we're working with the World Health Organization on this, to really consider and account for, similarly doing a gender analysis, but not just gender and equity analysis more broadly, to account for how things like curfews and lockdowns might affect different groups, how certain groups might be exposed differently, all of these different pieces of equity. So in real time, we're trying to apply some of those lessons and make sure that next time we face a pandemic, which hopefully will not be too soon, we are better prepared to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all groups.
I'll jump in with a really concrete example too. I think that the healthcare example is really, really powerful. And one of the things that I'm sure lots of you have been reading about and likely having sleepless nights about as well is the situation that's unfolding in Ukraine. And so really good example, I think, of how we have to be thinking about how different people's different identities is actually quite literally putting them or leaving them in harm's way. And so in the beginning, as we saw sort of Russian aggression building up along the Ukraine border, we in our office were really concerned about a particular, we're concerned about everybody, but we were very concerned about a group of women in Eastern Ukraine who tend to be older, who may be widows due to events since 2014, who may have limited mobility, limited funding, female head of households. These are the kinds of factors, age especially being one of them, and we don't always think about as having a real impact on your life and how you experience the events around you. And so this was something that, as the State Department was initially crafting its messaging, and as we were reaching out to various communities, basically trying to share, we were, I think, very, very forthcoming in sharing information and intelligence in the early days pre the Russian invasion. This was a group that our office was particularly concerned about and trying to get specific messaging to, because we knew it might take them more time to bring together funds to actually physically move their households to get children ready to actually arrange for transportation. And so I think these are the real kinds of things where strategy or not, we need to be thinking about how not everybody will experience the same horrible event in the same horrible ways, but that there are extra layers to all of our identities that will mean extra vulnerabilities.
Thank you for that. So I know earlier, Verena, you mentioned how, you guys are really thinking strategically about what you're putting in your implementation plans that you're developing at the State Department. And I'm sure Stephanie and Jamelia, your agencies are also thinking about that as well. And as you also know, the Center for Global Development offered some suggestions for how the administration can really develop a robust metric frameworks for how you all are measuring success as you start to implement the strategy through each of your agencies' prospective work. Can you tell me about what are some metrics each of your agencies are planning to develop, and how are you going to incorporate that in your implementation plan? And I'm sure you might be a little bit early into that, so you might not have all of that figured out, but I think we will start with Stephanie first, then Verena, then Jamelia.
Yes, I wish I could say that we were far enough into the process that we have a robust metrics framework, but we're not there yet. I will say that this is, a priority across the work that HHS does, both domestically and globally. And luckily, it's built into a lot of the structures that we already have in place. So, for example, the majority of CDC's work globally, which accounts for the majority of HHS's global work, is through PEPFAR. And PEPFAR obviously has a very robust metrics framework in place. So having that foundation, back to building sort of sustainable foundations, having that foundation in place makes it much easier to think about tracking success over time when we add new goals. I will also just add that as we think about some of these, maybe not newer areas, but newer initiatives, including the online GBV initiative, we're looking at how we can do a better job of tracking metrics, both in terms of incidence and prevalence of outcomes, and then progress in addressing it. Because if we don't understand the problems that we're trying to address, it's very difficult to know whether we're effectively addressing those problems. So I think from the perspective of CDC and NIH in particular, making sure we have the right data is a big part of the plan. I don't know if there's more that Verena or Jamila can share there.
Well, I think in terms of setting metrics, oh, sorry. Was it my turn? It was Verena's turn. Sorry about that.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, in terms of setting metrics, one of the things that Verena talked about, institutionalization, and that is so critical in this work. So one of the things that we are very conscious about as we look at the specific areas that we're identifying to take forward the goal, areas that we see as, to take forward the strategy, areas that we see as groundbreaking, is to build those metrics into the systems that we have that are already collecting data, collecting measurements, tracking our progress. And so either to draw on the indicators that exist and identify where we can leverage those to help us track progress on these goals, or identify ways that we can revise those existing systems to add these metrics. But we are not looking to kind of create separate processes. We want this to be integrated into how we work as an agency, and these goals be integrated in that way. And so that we're, again, tracking our progress, holding ourselves accountable, using the tools we already have as an agency to do that.
Yeah, Jamila, I think Jamila, I'll be perhaps a little bit less diplomatic than Jamila here and say, we have a lot of strategies and we have a lot of priorities, especially and including when it comes to gender. So we have a national action plan on women, peace, and security. I mentioned that we're in the process of updating. So this is just on the global side, I should be clear. We're in the process of updating the US strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally. we are, my office is tasked with developing the first ever women's economic security strategy. So we have strategies, and we're a small office. We're a small but mighty office. And so bureaus and consulates and even our folks here in DC hear from us a lot. And what we consistently hear is, this is great work, but we need to figure out a way to kind of, because we're tapping the same people over and over and over again. So from our office, what we are thinking through, and none of this is final, so I really want to just present this with not just a grain of salt, but with a whole, teaspoon, is creating, as Jamila said, like what are those indicators that can be leveraged across this, so that the NGS, or the National Gender Strategy, really is an umbrella. So what we're thinking through is a consolidated set of 8 or so indicators, measurement, evaluation, and learning, with sort of core measurements that would work across the gender strategy, as well as other associated gender strategies like WPS, GBV, Econ, to analyze and kind of improve how we're doing this institutionalization, how we're doing the integration, so that we are able to sit back on an annual basis and really learn from them, and then iterate and improve. So the first 4 or so measurements that we're thinking through, and none of them are final, obviously, are really could be grouped in kind of a coordination bucket. So how well are we engaging with civil society? How are we holding ourselves accountable? The White House has said that there will more than likely be an annual report that we'll engage in. And then I think that the second 4 bucket will be more around kind of like process. Have we done things? So one of the things that we've been really focused on is improving. USAID has a policy around preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. Are we going to, sorry, this maybe says to you, I've been talking for too long. Have we actually done sort of our mandate? Have we expanded our mandate on that? Have we mandated gender analysis? That's something that USAID does. That's something that we do for all of our programs, but have other operating units within the State Department also improve their processes. So I think we're thinking about this in very similar ways to USAID, like what are the things that we can do that can build and iterate, and trying to standardize those across all of the various gender things that we're doing. Gender related things, that we're doing.
Thank you. So I was going to say, Verena, I know earlier you talked a little bit about the president's budget request that will be coming out pretty soon. And as you all know, earlier this month on International Women's Day, the administration announced a landmark budget request of $2.6 billion to advance gender equality through U.S. foreign policy for FY23. We know that this is an historic announcement for this amount of funding going into programs focused on gender equality. Can you just talk to me a little bit about, like, if this amount of funding is appropriated to each of your respective agencies by Congress, what are some things or programs would you hope to see actualized? Like Jamila, I know you talked about really USAID's focus on transitioning a lot of their works to happening with more local partners. So would love to hear a little bit about what are your hopes that you would like to see, if this amount of funding is appropriated through the work that each of your agencies are doing. So maybe we go Jamila, Verena, and then Stephanie.
Yeah, on the 2.6 billion. USAID will be taking forward the majority of these resources, given how our budgets work on the foreign assistance. So the 2.6 billion is specifically on the budget that USAID and the State Department share. So that commitment will be specifically taken forward by our our department and agency. And it'll be, it is a commitment from within our budget. So we are saying within our budget, we are committing to spend 2.6 billion on gender equity and equality within our request, kind of as we've laid that out. And that is a commitment that we have both to invest in more programs that are dedicated to advancing gender equality and women's empowerment, It includes what we call gender secondary, which is where we integrate attention to gender equality and women's empowerment in broader programming across the development, humanitarian, security sectors. It includes our commitments on gender-based violence, whether both as standalone programs and integrated into other programs. Taking this work forward, we are committed collectively to addressing women and girls and all of with their intersecting identities. So looking at women and girls in Indigenous populations, in the disability community, LGBTQI+ community, across ages, youth, older women. And so it is part of our work as we take forward an intersectional lens, that as we take forward these resources, we are ensuring that they reach women and girls within the most marginalized and underserved populations as well. It also includes work that we do around engaging men and boys, around individuals with other gender identities, really looking across our work to advance gender equality and women's empowerment in all of the countries in which we work.
Yeah, so I think that there's a phrase that Jamila uttered that I think is really important to keep in mind, and I assume that one of your questions will be kind of how can we help? How can this community of really committed gender equality advocates and people who understand this, like, where do they see themselves in the strategy? And what Jamila said is, and what you said, Lenise, too, is if this money is appropriated. And so I think it's really, really critical to understand that the administration, that we are sending a very strong demand signal to Congress around the importance and the prioritization that we want to give gender equity and gender equality. And to be clear, the agencies will follow that demand signal, whether or not that there is specific money appropriated, right? We will be looking at our programs. We'll be at the State Department. We are pursuing aggressively and rigorously a strategy of gender analysis, especially to get at some of that gender secondary programming, so that we can increase the investments and increase the focus on gender equity and gender equality programs abroad. But this is really one of the critical pieces that we'll need to see active citizen and active engagement in if we're going to actually kind of have new money flows, is whether Congress or not appropriates that. So that's I think a really key piece. For me, I think it's too early to say where this money will be spent. It obviously hasn't been appropriated, and we're just beginning some of the technical conversations with our operating units and our colleagues around the building about, like, where can you be increasing your investments. But I'll just share, one of the early conversations that we've had that I'm really excited about is with a bureau that's not traditionally, I would say, necessarily focused on gender equity or gender equality. And it was not the first conversation with them, but it was a more broad conversation. They invest a lot in security, police officers, training, things of that nature. And so they were really curious to see, like, where do we see ourselves both in the strategy and where would we potentially see ourselves in this budget. And so that's one of those conversations when we talk about the strategy being a door opener and being an umbrella. If we can engage non-traditional actors in this space and get them to see themselves as holding the pen and being responsible for even a small portion of that 2.6, or even that small portion of the overall strategy with each of its 10 priorities, then I think that this has a greater chance of being successful. So for me, it's less about one big splashy program or one big splashy announcement, although of course we want that. It's really about like, what are all of the collective changes that we'll be doing together to get closer to that 2.6 figure so that it then becomes just part of the muscle that they use every year, whether we ask for 2.6 or 2.8 or 4.7 or whatever the number may end up being, as we're aiming higher and higher. And to be clear, I was making those numbers up on the fly. I'm not signaling anything there. I'm just saying the ambition is to go even bigger.
So I will just add briefly, although as Jamila said, the 2.6 billion is USAID state funding specifically. So it doesn't include HHS, except through PEPFAR potentially. But I do think the point that Verena made is a really, really important one, which is that we, can do everything with support of the leadership of our departments or agencies that is available with current funding and current authorities. And so I think that's really the signal that we've gotten from Secretary Becerra. He created this HHS task force on reproductive healthcare access that was launched in January, sort of anticipating what might happen again with the Supreme Court decision later this spring and summer, but also thinking about building in a longer term foundation to think about how HHS can address sexual and reproductive health rights and justice domestically and globally in the long term. And his message to all of us has been very much come to me with actions that I can take. What are the levers available to move forward on these priority areas? But there are limitations to the actions that can be taken. And so I think we will do everything we can within the current budget and levers. And when and if there's new resources available, there's more that we can do.
Thank you so much. And I just have one last question for the three of you before we go into our Q&A piece with our attendees. How can women in global health, a lot of the champions of gender that are on our call this evening, and other organizations support the advancement of the strategy and the administration's goals around gender equity and equality? Maybe we'll start with Verena, then Stephanie, then Jamelia.
So I'll just double down on what I said already. I think if you want to see action, the president talks about show me your budget, I'll show you what you value. I think that that's something that he feels very comfortable saying. We would like to see sort of additional funds appropriated, and then the best, I think, we've sent our signal, and the citizenry should also send their signals. Women in global health, the amount of data that you all have generated, the statistic that Haley read off at the beginning, you all don't claim enough credit for, but the 70 to 75% healthcare workforce and the 20 to 25% leadership positions, that's the kind of data that we're actually using and citing in our own strategies. You'll see yourselves in the strategy. And so that's the kind of data that we can use, and to keep generating that. I noticed that we have a number of folks who are in the research and implementation and all of that. That's all things that we can use, and you should consider this an open door. So Congress, data, advocacy, and then I think that we should recognize that we're the three of us are talking right now, but we're certainly not the only people doing any of this work, and far from it. I think we're talking about it and you're doing it. So to just say that we're also eager to learn from you, and that this is definitely a two-way door, not a one-way.
Yes, agree with Verena, and I think the head of our office, Assistant Secretary Pace, comes from civil society. She led Global Health Council previously. I also come from civil society, so I think it's been a big priority for our office to make sure that we're actively engaging with members of civil society, both in the US and around the world, and that's informing policymaking. So we've been intentional about doing that, but also, there's a reality that there are voices who reach out more regularly, and we take those meetings, and there are many, many more voices that we're not hearing from because they're not aware of the channels that are available. They don't know who to reach out to. So I think one area is that it's hugely helpful to make those connections and to lift up and synthesize the experiences and voices of people who don't have the ear of people who are in government as much. But also, just to echo Verena, I think something that Women in Global Health has been incredibly effective at is just putting together these campaigns and these concrete asks that are really useful for us. We can all describe problems and challenges, but coming forward with solutions and ways that the US government can move forward, and specifically that our different agencies can move forward, makes it much easier for us to try to navigate and advocate for those actions internally.
And I would just add, having come out of a think tank myself before this role, that, just to echo my colleagues, research is critical, data is critical. We need to continue to understand what the barriers are, what the gaps are, where do we see progress? Where are there promising approaches that we should be drawing on and scaling up? We've certainly made the commitment, the administrators made the commitment that we want to make our aid more accessible. We want to be pursuing more partnerships with actors across all of society, with bilateral governments, multilateral institutions, civil society, the corporate sector. And within that, as I said earlier, we have a huge commitment to localization and to really lifting up the work and supporting the work of local partners, including a commitment over the next decade to ensure that local partners are helping us shape our programs more, have more decision-making role within those programs. So I highlight that because as we talk about civil society, to note that we have a real commitment to partnering more with local civil society, local researchers, and really investing in and drawing on that resource.
Thank you so much, Jamelia, Verena, and Stephanie. Again, you really just highlighted some really key and important points, which I'm sure everyone here today will take away with them and just really think about how they can continue to support each of you all in the work that you're doing, especially as the strategy starts to roll out and starts to be implemented. Before we go to closing remarks, I just wanted to see if anyone had any questions that they wanted to ask our speakers directly. You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question or put it in the chat. If you do unmute yourself, please do feel free to introduce yourself and ask your questions, whether it's to all three of our speakers or to one of them directly. I'm going to take silence as there is no questions. So if you don't have any questions.
Such a good job covering all the things there.
Great.
Or maybe
So,
it's almost 5:30.
Yeah, so since no one has questions, I'm going to turn it over to Colleen with the WGH Midwest chapter for our closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Lenise, and thank you for the speakers for a great discussion. Certainly, I think I speak for everyone when I say that we heard about a very ambitious strategy, but even more so about what concretely you and your departments are or agencies are doing, and this is certainly great to hear. We are definitely at a crucial junction globally, from moving from a place where the U.S. Gender policies had potentially been seen as punitive in the recent past to try to move forward with ambition and also certainly with programs that span everything that we discussed from climate change to SRHR. We are also at another crucial junction around the world where we have a conflict that is very visible, getting a lot of attention, as opposed to some of the prior conflicts that may not have been at the forefront of every television, news, social media, and Twitter. We know that women and girls are often the first to suffer from conflicts and are the ones who are the most severely affected. And great to hear that that the U.S. Will be taking gender as a specific focus when we're talking about conflict and humanitarian response. We are still in a pandemic as well. 70% of the health workforce globally are women, and women have taken that pandemic and the world on their shoulders. This, as you know, is a priority for women in global health to make sure that women in the health workforce are supported, their needs are taken into account, especially when we're talking about future pandemic preparedness. So I would say that in Women in Global Health and all of our U.S. chapters who work together and under the leadership of our DC chapter for this event, we are looking forward to supporting you we certainly heard for the need of data, kind of policy contributions, responding to consultations, but also supporting you on your funding priorities, etc., locally within our own leadership. And we are certainly looking forward to that. So once again, I want to thank you all for this wonderful discussion, and certainly looking for opportunities where we, the U.S. chapters, can contribute more to the agendas that you outlined. For our audience as well, as a reminder, we have several chapters in the United States, including one which is a regional chapter in the Midwest. Certainly a great opportunity to get involved in a lot of the activities that are going on. So please feel free to reach out to any of the chapter leads and join us in our continued work towards achieving gender equity and equality globally. So thank you all very much, and over to you, Lenise.
Thank you all again for joining us. Jamelia, Verena, Stephanie, again, thank you for this really open and frank discussion with us, and just really giving us a deeper insight into what each of your agency is doing around gender equality and achieving gender equity. As Colleen mentioned, please do reach out to us if you are interested in getting involved in any one of the chapters, whether that's DC, Seattle, Boston, or Midwest. This event is a second part of a 3-part series. We hope to have a 3rd part to this event sometime in the summer. And I would just say, if you're not signed up for our newsletter, please do sign up and stay tuned for future events. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Lenise.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great night.